Good morning, and thank you for joining me on the Path to Liberty. I'm Michael Bolden with the 10th Amendment Center, and this is the show for Monday, October 3rd, 2022. I hope you've had a great weekend, but let's get right to it. I think it's been maybe a year since I covered the General Welfare Clause. That's one of the big three in the Constitution, along with supremacy and commerce. Well, big four, I guess, if we want to add necessary and proper, that they have been twisted and distorted to support the monster state of today, the largest government in history. On this episode, rather than getting into details of what the General Welfare Clause was supposed to mean and how it was supposed to be used, I'll briefly mention that. I've got some warnings from primarily anti-federalist writers on how they expected it to be used in practice, and I think some of them came out to be absolutely correct, prophetic almost. Maybe a little bit was wrong, and maybe some of them just haven't come to pass yet. I'll leave that for you to decide, but first of all, before getting to that, a quick hello and a huge thank you. Thank you so much for being here. Whether this is your first episode or you've been here for every single one since day one, I can't thank you enough. I should also mention that if you want to follow along with the stuff that I'm going to go through in this episode, I've got a lot of source documents, some other articles, and all kinds of stuff. Because I'm just going to scratch the surface. You definitely want to read in context and learn on your own time. You'll find a show links section in the blog post that I will run within the next few hours after this live stream is done. I should also mention that I'm in the process of moving out of Los Angeles after most of my adult life for the past close to 30 years. So I'm actually not going to be doing a show this coming Friday and probably not the following Monday. And I'm going to cut maybe this one and Wednesdays a little bit shorter, skip over some of the live chat and stuff, but please do continue to leave me comments, whether it's live or in the archive. I will read through them over the next few days as I'm able to in between the move, and I get so many great ideas for future episodes, so many questions and comments that I can get back to sometimes. You can also email me over at team@10thamendmentcenter.com. Anyways, the show homepage is 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. So let's dive right in and start out with the text of the General Welfare Clause. It says the Congress shall have power to lay and collect taxes, duties, imposts, and excises, to pay the debts and provide for the common defense and general welfare of the United States, but all duties, imposts, and excises shall be uniform throughout the United States. This was one of the primary motivations for the people who wanted to go from the Articles of Confederation to the Constitution for the United States. Very few people were opposed to the idea, were in support of the Articles version. The only one I really am aware of, the requisition system, was Patrick Henry, and he made a pretty interesting case about that. Maybe I should cover it in more detail at some point. Most people were wanting the new general government to have some taxing power that it didn't have. The debate was primarily either over how much it should have or how the terms should be written so they're not abused. And I know that today almost everyone thinks that general welfare is about the feds writing checks for whatever they want. But this is so far from the original legal meaning of the clause, it's almost absurd. Now, here's how Thomas Jefferson described things. He said, "Our tenet ever was that Congress had not unlimited powers to provide for the general welfare, but were restrained to those specifically enumerated." These days, they really treat it is so close. If the largest government in history isn't unlimited power, we're so close, it's barely a difference at all. Here from an article, a long law review paper by Rob Natelson, The General Welfare Clause and the Public Trust, an essay in original understanding. He put it this way, this is the overview. Based on founding era word usage, public representations by advocates of the Constitution, and other historical evidence, the paper concludes that the General Welfare Clause is a limitation on the taxing power. Instead of a broad grant of additional powers to do whatever they want, to spend on whatever programs they want, or run welfare programs, for example, it was actually intended as a limitation on the taxing power. The position of the modern Supreme Court, writes Rob, that the clause authorizes spending for the general welfare is based on insufficient research and an anachronistic understanding of language. In other words, it's really just a crock. That's how I put it. And here's a quote from his paper. He said, "The clause was designed as a trust-style rule, denying Congress authority to levy taxes for any but general national purposes." It couldn't just say, well, we want to fund research on the migratory habits of this thing in this area. It had to be very general national purposes. Rob goes on, he says, because the clause prevented Congress from using tax revenue for local or special interest purposes, which is, they do this constantly, the clause indirectly qualified the appropriation power. Even if some enumerated power could be enlisted to support the appropriation, federal tax money was not to be used for the private benefit of a museum, for example. This is an interesting example, however worthy in Savannah, nor an artist, however struggling, in New York. And that's so much of the spending that goes on today. All of it unconstitutional, none of it authorized under the original legal meaning of the General Welfare Clause. He said to take the clause as a general grant of power for the federal government to do virtually anything would, and this is our writing from our General Welfare Clause resource page, as James Madison put it, it would be a metamorphosis of the Constitution into a character which there is a host of proofs was not contemplated by its creators. So the way that they use it today, just briefly, is, according to James Madison, a metamorphosis of the Constitution into something never, ever, ever contemplated by the creators. Now, honestly, I don't think anyone should be surprised at this point that people in power have twisted the original legal meaning of the General Welfare Clause into something that has helped build the largest government in history, the monster state of today. But if you want to learn more about what it's supposed to be, I have an episode that I did, it looks like just under a year ago, back in November of 2021, the General Welfare Clause, an introduction. Let me see how long this one is. I don't want to play the audio, but it's a pretty long one, I think. Almost 40 minutes. So if you really want to get some detail of the original legal meaning of the clause under the Constitution, I will link to that in the show notes over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path-to-liberty. And of course, the blog post for this episode will go up probably with my moving, probably a little bit later than normal today, but I will definitely get that rolling. Anyway, so we shouldn't be surprised that they've been twisting and expanding this. This is what we were warned against over and over and over. Just in a general sense that people with power will always try to expand their power and claim that it's all legal. Here's John Williams in the New York Ratifying Convention, who may have been the great anti-federalist writer Brutus and also maybe Cato. We don't know for sure. He said, ingenious men may assign ingenious reasons for opposite constructions of the same clause. So two totally different views come from two totally different people, even at the same time. John Dickinson, in his great Letters from a Farmer in Pennsylvania in 1767, pointed out that all artful rulers, in a way that's kind of redundant, all artful rulers who strive to extend their power beyond its just limits, again, redundant. So we have to understand human nature. People with power will always seek to expand it. And this is how they do it. They try to make it look as legal as possible because if not, back in the day, heads would roll. These days, people claim to vote the bums out and then just once in a while someone gets swapped out, but the system keeps rolling. The deep state continues. Anyways, Dickinson, all artful rulers who strive to extend their power beyond its just limits endeavor to give their attempts as much semblance of legality as possible. Or here, the great anti-federalist writer, Federal Farmer, we thought for many years, I did as well, that it was Richard Henry Lee, almost certain that it was not. But anyways, Federal Farmer, October 12th, 1787. Men who govern will, in doubtful cases, construe laws and constitutions most favorably for increasing their own powers. One of the arguments of the Anti-Federalists, whether it was necessary and proper or general welfare or something else, was that these terms were not specific enough. And if they're not specific, no matter how you define them the way they're supposed to be in law, in practice over time, people are going to define them in the ways that they want to define them to give themselves the most power. These are maxims that were understood. Dickinson was no anti-federalist. He was writing not in 1767, but during ratification, he certainly was in support of ratification of the Constitution. So with all that, I want to get to more specific warnings about the General Welfare Clause. And for that, we first have to go back more than a decade to 1775, to Benjamin Franklin's proposed Articles of Confederation of July of 1775. I believe this was the first proposal for an Articles of Confederation, just months after Lexington and Concord. Here it is in Article 2. This is on or before July 21st, 1775. Article 2, that said United Colonies. I'm just going to kind of jump through some pieces here so it makes a little sense. Well, hopefully. That said the said United Colonies hereby severally enter into a firm league of friendship with each other, binding themselves and their posterity for defense against their enemies, for the security of their liberties and properties, the safety of their persons and families, and their mutual and general welfare. So there it is. Also, Article 5, the Congress shall also make such general ordinances as though necessary to the general welfare. Now, this wasn't taken up for a vote, but Benjamin Franklin shopped it around to the brightest people of the time. For example, Thomas Jefferson was one of them who had a copy, and there are records of Thomas Jefferson's annotated copy of this where he wrote notes on this. And in the section on the last page of his copy, he wrote, and this is how archives.gov put it, he wrote this significant comment. Question, what their mutual and general welfare means. So he saw that and it struck him. Well, what does that actually mean? He said there should be no vague terms in an instrument of this kind. Its objects should be precisely and determinately fixed. So as I was saying just a minute ago, the anti-federalist argument some years later, Jefferson was no anti-federalist. In fact, he didn't consider himself a federalist or anti, but in a letter to Francis Hopkinson some years later, he said, I'm much closer to the Federalists, although if I could go to heaven but with a party, I would not go there at all. I'm probably butchering that, but that's my best memory of it. But here in 1775, he's specifically saying, don't have a term that's broad, that's not clearly defined, because that could be a problem. Now, I'm not aware of him making a similar statement about the phrase general welfare that was actually used, not in this way, but in the Article 2, it was used in that way to promote basically kind of like the preamble in essence. I didn't see anything from him, and maybe someone else is more of a Jefferson expert on this would know, but I didn't see him, at least in my reading over the years, complaining or talking about that phrase in the Articles of Confederation or in his correspondence during the ratification debates about the Constitution. He was primarily concerned with getting a Bill of Rights added, and that's what we see over and over and over. But specifically back in 1775, he thought the term general welfare was vague. And here, Brutus. Well, this is from Jason Mandrish over at Founder of the Day. For those of you who listen to or watch this show regularly, you know this is a regular great resource, founderoftheday.com. One of these days I should reach out to him and let him know how much I appreciate the work that he does. He does YouTube work. I've never met him, but I love the historical insight. Really short, easy to read stuff. Anyways, he's talking about Brutus number 6. And he said, Brutus, this is a great anti-federalist writer, he said, notes that taxes can be raised for the general welfare, which is an extremely open-ended term that, when spoken by the right charismatic person, can mean literally anything. What a surprise. If you take in conjunction the types of warnings about how ingenious men or all artful rulers will always try to give what they do as much legality as possible, as much semblance of legality as possible, it's very similar to what we see some years later, that Brutus noted that when given this type of a term, the right person can turn that into a power to do anything. Here's Brutus in his own words, December 27, 1787. This is number 6. He also talked about general welfare a little bit in his first paper and his fifth paper, on and on and on. He said, I would ask those who reason thus to define what ideas are included under the terms to provide for the common defense and general welfare. That's just what Jefferson was asking regarding Franklin's proposal for the Articles in 1775. So same type of question. What does this mean? He said, are these terms definite? And will they be understood in the same manner and to apply to the same cases by everyone? No one will pretend they will, is how he put it. It will then be a matter of opinion, what tends to the general welfare, and the Congress will be the only judges in that matter. So Surprise, surprise. I think that one, he really called that for sure. Here he is again. He said, it is as absurd to say that the power of Congress is, mind you, there is some back and forth with the Federalists, and the Federalists are saying, this is not what this term means in the legal document that is to be the Constitution for the United States. It doesn't mean that. Let us explain what it means. And Brutus is saying, okay, that may be the case, but in practice, I don't expect it to play out like that. He even acknowledges that it could be what they're saying, but he rejects in practice. He said it is as absurd to say that the power of Congress is limited by these general expressions to provide for the common safety and general welfare, as it would be to say that it would be limited had the Constitution said they should have power to lay taxes, etc., at will and pleasure. So he's responding a little bit later in that paragraph to the notion that, well, the Federalists are saying that's not what it means. He says, but however just this reasoning may be, it would be found in practice a most pitiful restriction. I think that's something he called as well. And I think that's the situation with all governments. All governments, as St. George Tucker put it in 1803, in view of the Constitution of the United States, have a natural tendency towards an increase and an assumption of power, a usurpation of power. All governments, not some, not a few, not most, not just the ones over there, all of them, including the so-called land of the free. So Brutus is saying here in practice, no matter how restrictive you're saying this language about common defense and general welfare is, in practice, it is a pitiful restriction. In practice, that's exactly how it's played out. The words on paper don't enforce themselves. And it was a very pitiful restriction, really. The government would always say their measures were designed and calculated to promote the public good, and there being no judge between them and the people, the rulers themselves must and would always judge for themselves. We shouldn't be surprised when you give the government or you allow the government the power to determine the extent of its own power, and then on top of it, you give it phrases that can be defined kind of broadly. You shouldn't be surprised when you end up under the largest government in history. So that was some warnings from Brutus in paper number 6. As I mentioned, there were also some warnings in 5 and 1 and elsewhere. He repeatedly hammers on this type of a messaging. Here from John, I've never said this one out loud. I only read it. I'm not sure if it's Smiley or whatever. Pennsylvania Ratifying Convention, November 28th, 1787. He warned that the power to tax could, quote, be easily perverted to other purposes. They were concerned that the General Welfare Clause was going to be used very broadly. Richard Henry Lee, in a letter to Samuel Adams, combines all of it, talking about the corrupting nature of power, how power corrupts and expands and grows, and then a broad term makes it even worse. He said the corrupting nature of power. This is, again, Richard Henry Lee to Samuel Adams, his great friend, October 5th, 1787. The corrupting nature of power and its insatiable appetite for increase hath proved the necessity and procured the adoption of the strongest and most express declarations of that residuum of natural rights which is not intended to be given up to society. Of course, Richard Henry Lee and Samuel Adams were both agitating for a Bill of Rights to be added, and they were concerned that if you didn't have more express restrictions, then you were going to run into some problems. And that's because of the corrupting nature of power and its insatiable appetite for increase. He says, in a government, therefore, in that situation where you recognize human nature, when the power of judging what shall be for the general welfare, which goes to every object of human legislation, and where the laws of such judges shall be the supreme law of the land, it seems to be of the last consequence to declare in most explicit terms the reservations above alluded. So, again, looking at the idea of general welfare as, well, in his view, going to the object, every object of human legislation. Here's William Sims Jr. in the Massachusetts Ratifying Convention, also anti-federalist, warning against his concerns about the General Welfare Clause. He says, these words, sir, I confess, are an ornament to the page and very musical words, but they are too general to be understood as any kind of limitation of the power of Congress and not very easy to be understood at all. When you use more higher level legal phrases, the average person is going to be confused by it. Most people don't know that the necessary and proper clause is based on the legal doctrine of principles and incidents. And even if they heard that, and maybe you're hearing me say that, you're like, dude, what the heck are you talking about? What does that mean? So the more that you get into legalese, the less that the general public can understand. And if the general public doesn't understand, then they defer to the experts. And if the experts are bad people, then you shouldn't be surprised what happens. And what happens is, well, what we've got today. So I think this is a really important one. I want to repeat it. These words, sir, I confess, are an ornament to the page and very musical words, but they are too general to be understood as any kind of limitation of the power of Congress and not very easy to be understood at all. So he did not expect this to be a limitation on power, not something that the general public, the average person, could be easily understood, and the results weren't going to be good. He said the term general welfare might be applied to any expenditure whatever. And I'm sure there are plenty of people out there. You could throw out the craziest ideas, craziest social program that they're not even trying yet today and say, where in the Constitution is this authorized? I'm sure someone who's heard something is going to say Commerce Clause, necessary and proper, supremacy, general welfare. Most of the time they say general welfare. If you want to hand out loot, you want to spend money on something, people who have heard of any of these phrases, unfortunately, most people haven't heard even of any of them in the first place, but people who even know of something, they're going to claim that it comes from the General Welfare Clause. And that's what William Sims was warning about. It's going to be, or it might be applied to any expenditure whatever. Here's John Williams again. In the New York Ratifying Convention, he expected it to basically essentially destroy the states, turn them into kind of what Hamilton had dreamed of just days after the Philadelphia Convention. He wanted the new general or national government to basically absorb the states, but I want to cover that more in another episode. He said, here's John Williams, now if the Congress should judge it a proper provision for the common defense and general welfare that the state governments should be essentially destroyed, essentially, not literally, but essentially. And we see that in essence in practice today in many ways. He said, what in the name of common sense will prevent them? Are they not constitutionally authorized to pass such laws? Are not the terms common defense and general welfare indefinite, undefinable terms? That's another hint that maybe Williams was Brutus because it's the same type of a message. But then again, this was a very consistent message from the Anti-Federalist side that it was too broad, it was not well defined, it was undefinable, and therefore people with power would certainly use that to their advantage. He says, what checks have the state governments against such encroachments? Patrick Henry, June 14th, 1788, in the Virginia Ratifying Convention, he said, if Congress shall say that the general welfare requires it, we could just enter blank at that point, because that's basically how it goes now. If Congress shall say that the general welfare requires it, they may keep armies continually on foot. There is no control on Congress in raising or stationing them. This unlimited authority is a most dangerous power. Its principles are despotic. If it be unbounded, it must lead to despotism. For the power of a people in a free government is supposed to be paramount to the existing power. So he's expecting that this general welfare clause is an unlimited authority. It's a most dangerous power, and it must lead to despotism. To the founding generation, a government that can do what it wants when it wants, that can change things on a whim, a living, breathing constitution in essence, is an arbitrary government. An arbitrary government is how they define tyranny. So this is what we have right now. Even though we can still exercise some rights, I think so far we're just lucky that they haven't made it worse and worse and worse. And this one I think rounds it out the best. This is James Madison in the First Congress, Debates in Congress, February 6, 1792. He said, if Congress can apply, now he's actually arguing against this kind of plenary, this broad-based authority under general welfare, and this is why. He said, if Congress can apply money indefinitely to the general welfare and are the sole and supreme judges of the general welfare, they think of all the things that he said they might be able to do. They may take the care of religion into their own hands. They may establish teachers in every state, county, and parish and pay them out of the public treasury. They may take into their own hands the education of children, establishing in like manner schools throughout the Union. They may assume the provision for the poor. They may undertake the regulation of all roads other than just post roads. In short, everything from the highest object of state legislation down to the most minute object of police would be thrown under the power of Congress. Now, mind you, Madison wasn't talking about this, and his audience, even listening to this, weren't thinking this were positive. Oh, yeah, have schools and teachers and the federal government paying for the police and regulating all the roads. That sounds awesome. No, this was maybe someone would have called it fear-mongering. Madison, man, he's really gone off his rocker. He's fear-mongering, thinking that the federal government is going to get involved in education and pay for teachers and educate kids and fund police. No way, that's never going to happen. But he warned that if they use the general welfare in the way that they use it today, that's what they could do. Anyways, it's not awesome news. It's not awesome stuff, but certainly we have to be aware of what we're facing. It's pretty dangerous. We were warned that this was bad news. But we want to get this kind of information out to more and more people every day. Nothing helps us get that job done more than the financial faith and support of our members. I do want to take a quick moment and give a huge thank you to just a handful of people who have joined us lately and are helping us reach and teach people about the Constitution and liberty and how to defend both when government refuses to do so, which is, well, 24/7, 365. There's Thomas in Florida, John in Nevada, I apologize. I always forget which way I'm supposed to do that. Candace in Nebraska, Alan in Idaho, and Patricia in West Virginia. You can also join us for as little as $2 a month over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. A quick reminder, I'm definitely not going to be doing a show this Friday. It's possible I will have a show next week, Monday. I'm going to be here, well, today and then on Wednesday's show. Then I'm going to need a few days off to wrap up my move. And depending on how long it takes me to get my new studio set up in the clean, quiet, safe suburbs that I'm moving to, that I'm very excited about, depends on how long it takes me to get my studio set up, I will either be back next week, Monday, or on Wednesday. Anyways, you can follow us along over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path-to-liberty. Again, 10thamendmentcenter.com/path-to-liberty. Thank you so much for any consideration you can give to join us as a member today. I really appreciate your support. I really appreciate you being here. I hope your week is off to a good start, and I'll see you next time here on the Path to Liberty.